I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. Space, once a distant destination, has become yet another battleground for great power competition. Since the early days of the People's Republic of China, the country has been pursuing a series of ambitious space programs aimed to build up its capacity in space as an essential element of its comprehensive national power. In recent years, under the Xi Jinping regime, Beijing has significantly increased its investment in its civilian space program. Of course, its military program as well, but we'll be focusing primarily on the civilian space program, I think, today. And it has, of course, a plan to send Chinese taikonauts to the moon before the United States can return. As the U.S.-China strategic competition continues to heighten, it's vital to understand China's space policy and its role in China's grand strategy. To discuss these issues, I am pleased to be joined by Dean Cheng, who is Senior Advisor to the China Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace and is also a non-resident fellow with George Washington University Space Policy Institute. And he focuses on China's space program as well as its military doctrine and dual-use issues associated with China's scientific and technical enterprises. And Dean Cheng recently published a fantastic book titled China and the New Moon Race, so I think we'll be getting some insights into his book today. So welcome, Dean, and congrats on the new book.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So in your book, you call the current space competition Space Race 2.0. So how does the current space race differ from the first space race between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Well, to begin with, if you think back to the original early days of the space race, the U.S. and Soviet Union were literally launching rockets almost once a month. A lot of this was experimental. You didn't know what the right atmosphere makeup should be, and we lost astronauts on Apollo 1 as a result. You didn't know how to do a spacewalk, and the early spacewalks were incredibly dangerous. You didn't even necessarily know how to launch multiple satellites, and it was all government. It was the U.S. government and the Soviet government. Today, space is much more mature. People do spacewalks. We have two space stations up there, the Chinese one and the International Space Station. But we also have a much larger commercial presence. The private sector today is its own space player. This is most obvious with Elon Musk's Starlink and its role in places like Ukraine. But think about Planet Labs and Maxar, who are providing the world with pictures of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you make a phone call to Europe or to Asia from here in the United States, you're probably going over a communication satellite, which almost certainly is not owned by a government. All of that adds up to a very different space environment, and that's why I think it's Space Race 2.0.
China's pursued its ambitions in space since the 1950s, really long before it had the advanced technological capabilities that it has today. So why is China so obsessed with space? What are the motivations behind this program? And what role, maybe looking backward, as space played in China's grand strategy?
So space ultimately is a luxury program. There are wealthy countries out there that don't have much of a space program. Switzerland lives very happily in its environment, very wealthy, does not launch rockets. Sweden has very limited space capability, etc. Having a space capability sends several signals. One, I have the spare industrial resources, financial resources, and above all, human resources, the spare engineers, the spare minds to go into space. The second part of this is it is a wonderful advertisement for your level of science and technology. It grabs people in a way that a lot of other advanced projects, the Large Hadron Collider, things like that, they're cool to those who are in the field, but they don't capture the imagination. Nobody made a TV series called Proton Trek, right? It was Star Trek, Star Wars, these things. And for the Chinese, that's a third piece, capturing global imagination, showing not just to the Chinese people, look at what we, the Chinese Communist Party, have done, but showing to the world. And all of that adds up at the end of the day to Xi Jinping being able to say, I did this. Okay, I'll be generous. We, the CCP, did this. But that's a very important message about legitimacy to the Chinese people and whether it's you want to call it deterrence or influence for the rest of the world.
What are a few of the key achievements that China has made so far in its civil space program? And then what are the new developments and trends under Xi Jinping's administration?
So I think one of the things that's useful to remember is that China was only the third country to deploy what's called PNT, Position, Navigation, and Timing. We were the first, GPS, Global Positioning System. The Soviets deployed something called GLONASS, but the Chinese developed Beidou, and they developed it on their own. The initial program was really was a regional one, but now it is global. In fact, it has in some ways better coverage than GPS, and that puts them actually ahead of Europe. They have actually a full portfolio of satellite capabilities, weather, communications, Earth observation, exploration. They've gone to the moon. They've landed on the far side of the moon, something no one else has done before. And something to think about, until about 2022, every picture we got from Mars was American. No other country had successfully landed anything on Mars. And then the Chinese landed Tianwen, and they became only the second nation to successfully land on Mars. And unlike everybody else, unlike us, unlike the Russians in Europe, they did it on their first try. And now they are talking about going to the moon, landing humans on the moon, and further developing things like a Mars sample retrieval mission. That will be robotic, but still bringing back samples from another planet. That's a huge, huge move.
Is China's approach to achieving these ambitions in its civil space program similar in some ways to how the United States and Russia have pursued their ambitions, or is it totally different?
It's actually very different. John Logsdon, professor emeritus in the Space Policy Institute, author of many books on space, posited that the American space program, the entire space program, really began on December 8th, 1941. That if only we had seen the Imperial Japanese fleet approaching Pearl Harbor, we could have avoided that catastrophe. If Dr. Logsdon is correct, then in parallel, the Soviet space program then began on June 23rd, 1941. If only we had seen the massing of 3 million troops in what used to be Poland and used to be the Baltics, then in that case, we could have stopped the Hitlerite legions. China never had anything like that. There is no Pearl Harbor in Chinese history. And so the Chinese space program really began because Mao Zedong said, 我们也要搞卫星. We too have to make satellites, but also as much more prestige, which Deng Xiaoping then made practical. He basically said, look, we don't have the money for these vanity projects. Show me satellites that make a difference. And so it was communication satellites and later PNT on his successor's watch, but he had a lot of the credit for that. So this is a very different, and then, in the open source literature, the Chinese still don't seem to have deployed missile early warning satellites. Those were some of the first things we deployed and one of the first things the Soviets deployed. It's one of the few things the Russians have absolutely tried to maintain, even with a very, very bad space budget.
We're seeing in the United States more growing cooperation between public and private sectors. We see NASA, for example, partnering with SpaceX to send astronauts to the moon and to the International Space Station. China's, of course, the relationship in China of the military and the private sector, the public and the private sector, is so different than in the United States. So could you talk a little bit about that? And, of course, the military-civilian integration program and how that relates to its space program, and what is actually the role of the private sector then in China in its space program.
So let's begin with the United States. We are a rich country. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. But to give you a sense of how rich we have 4 space programs. Many people don't realize that. We have NASA. Those are the folks everybody's aware of, with the NASA patch, landing on the moon, going to Mars, taking cool pictures of Pluto, etc. There's also NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They run our weather satellites. They also run things like Landsat, civilian use Earth observation systems important for agriculture. Then we had the U.S. Air Force, now the U.S. Space Force, the military space program. And finally, the intelligence community has its own space program. How can we afford for? Because we're rich. China, in its view, and to some extent it's true, is nowhere near as wealthy. It has to make every renminbi count. So there isn't really a military and civilian space program. There's a national space program. And the Chinese weather satellites serve the Chinese Meteorological Agency. They also serve the PLA. Ditto for communications and all the rest. What is interesting is that up until, say, 2015, the Chinese space industrial complex was entirely comprised of 2 state-owned enterprises, each about 100,000 people, which is about the size of Boeing, but neither of them made airliners or helicopters. They only made space-related systems. Around 2015, the Chinese opened up their aerospace sector to the private sector, real private companies. Basically, if you can make money, you get to keep it. You're not here simply to do what the state tells you. Now, the reality, however, has been, 1, some of these companies really are offshoots of the state-owned enterprises, and 2, as you know, and your audience hopefully does, there's a party committee in every company in China. It doesn't matter whether it's private or state-owned. But the idea here for the Chinese was, nothing motivates like the chance to make money. And so they basically opened the doors to private companies. Hey, if you can get to work and make money, you get to keep it. And we have seen is methane-powered rockets. Chinese just let contracts out for reusable rockets. They're really pushing a variety of different technologies in their private sector. Meanwhile, the state-owned enterprises produce the older but very reliable Long March series of launch vehicles, big satellites for communications and military purposes, because the state needs to know it has this capacity.
So you talked earlier, of course, about the aspirations for China to do more with Mars and what they've already done. But we'll set that aside, talk first about the moon, which I think, landing on the moon is still on Beijing's space agenda, has been for some time. And seems like it's been racing against the United States to get there with their taikonauts before the U.S. gets there for, visit number 2. So if China successfully achieves this mission, what do you think would be some of the political, the strategic, and even economic implications domestically for China, but also internationally?
Well, certainly if China succeeds, and eventually they will, you work at it long enough and hard enough and pour enough money in, this is engineering. When the Chinese land a crew on the moon, it will be an enormous moment for Chinese history. The Chinese people will have done something only the United States has done. It will have beaten the Japanese, it will have beaten the Indians, it will have beaten the Russians, it will have beaten Europe. But that's really not the key. One landing, one planting of a flag, very cool. Xi Jinping can be very proud of that. But it's pretty clear the Chinese want more than that. They want to set the terms of what's termed cislunar space. Cislunar space basically is the entire volume between Earth and the moon, all the way up to Lagrange points. The point here being, if you were to fly from Barcelona to Bangkok, from takeoff to landing, what is spoken in the cockpits and from every air traffic control way station? English. Why? Because the United States was the leading consumer of air travel when the rules were written. What the Chinese are pretty clearly trying to do is to make sure that literally and figuratively, the language for at least cislunar space will be Chinese. And it would be very hard to argue against that if China establishes a base on the moon and does, let's say, 4 visits every year, year after year, to that space, to that lunar base. If the West is doing 1 or 2 a year, What's the argument for English being the language? What's the argument for the U.S. setting the technical standards, the data standards? Why shouldn't it be the Chinese? Actually, we're seeing this right now in artificial intelligence with this week's turmoil from DeepSeek. All of a sudden, this Chinese upstart AI is causing massive, not ripples, but waves in the AI world. Imagine this was true in space.
So if China has some kind of an accident, I mean, obviously the United States, Russia, we've had our major accidents. We've had lives lost. And as far as I know, China has not experienced any real major failures that have had lives lost, although perhaps they could have hidden it. Would it be a big setback for China if that happened?
Certainly, I mean, one, as far as we know, I agree with you, there have been no losses. And two, I think everyone is very happy about that. I don't think anyone wishes ill on astronauts of any nationality. That being said, I think that one of the things this has reflected is a Chinese balancing act between pushing as hard as they can, but not so far that you wind up losing people. If they did, I think initially Xi Jinping being the figure, if you want the glory, you have to take the responsibility. But I think one of the things that would most likely occur is that the Chinese would make them martyrs. Let us always remember this crew of Shenzhou, crew of Tiangong, whatever, and let us make sure that their sacrifices were not in vain. So I think the Chinese would absolutely redouble their commitment. Now, in the meantime, I suspect project directors, managers, and a lot of officials are going to find themselves in very, very hot water. But that's a separate issue.
China and Russia have been leading the effort to build the International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS, and apparently 13 countries have already joined the initiative. So what will be the impacts of ILRS on the U.S.-China space competition and more broadly on international geostrategic competition?
Well, at the moment, the U.S.-led effort is the Artemis Accords, a basic set of rules of the road, if you will, not a treaty. But if you sign on, you're saying this is how we're going to behave. ILRS is more of a technical set of agreements. Hey, we're going to the moon, sign up with us and we'll go. Very strikingly, I believe no nation has signed up to both, although one may have. The UAE is interesting. One of their universities signed on to ILRS, but the UAE signed on to Artemis. I think if the Chinese beat the U.S. to the moon, this could produce a very interesting ripple effect of potentially having nations pull out of Artemis and join ILRS, or at a minimum, signing on to both. And the optics of this would be because Artemis has something like 50 countries signed on. And that's because NASA has the best branding in the world, and the U.S. is the country that actually landed on the moon. If nations started switching sides, the optics is going to be, from the Chinese perspective, yeah, you guys landed on the moon. Congratulations. You can get out of the way now. Make way for the new up-and-comers. And I think that is absolutely the political message that Chinese diplomats will be sending around the world.
What are the differing perspectives that the U.S. and some of its allies have in terms of their responses to what China is achieving and its agenda in space? And there's obviously some different rules and approaches. The United States is very limited in what we can do with China, if anything at all. Maybe you can explain that. But Europe has a different perspective. So maybe talk about that.
So under the Wolf Amendment, the U.S., specifically NASA and OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, are prohibited from spending a single dollar on interactions with the Chinese. Now, notice what that means in bilateral relations. One, it does not prohibit all contact. So NOAA, for example, can certainly exchange weather information. Two, there are steps that can be taken to obtain waivers from the Wolf Amendment, and they've actually been invoked. Three, NASA and OSTP at multilateral, multinational events, conferences that at the UN, for example, are allowed to interact with the Chinese. Europe has a somewhat schizophrenic view. On the one hand, the head of the European Space Agency, a month after the Chinese conducted their anti-satellite tests in 2007, declared that he welcomed the opportunity to cooperate with China in space, which is not the kind of message you really want to send after the worst debris-generating event in space history. The more recent, I believe the current head of the European Space Agency, on the other hand, has basically said, we are not going to do a joint human spaceflight mission with the Chinese, period. As the Chinese have been found to engage in more and more intellectual property theft and technology transfer efforts out of Europe, there does seem to have been a broader shift within a lot of Europe, but not all, towards skepticism in terms of cooperating with the Chinese.
So, what are the risks that are inherent in the U.S.-China civilian space race? And are there guardrails or agreements that we need to control these risks?
Not sure about the risks. One of the biggest problems is the Chinese space program, and Dr. Lawson said this, is the most opaque space program he's ever studied. It's more opaque than the Soviet space program. There are basic fundamental things. How much does China spend on space? We're not talking about specific, we're not talking about their military, just big top-line budget numbers. We don't have that because the Chinese have successfully hidden it from us. And they don't ever answer that question. That question has been asked by a variety of people, including yours truly. And they basically said, no, why do you want to know that? It's a private number. This and the fact that we also don't have a good understanding of how the Chinese space program is organized, but we do know that every Chinese space launch facility is a PLA facility. There are no exceptions. That adds up to the reality that even civilian space cooperation means getting in bed with the PLA. And that has, you have to weigh the costs and the benefits on that. In terms of risks, really the biggest risk right now, I think, in some quarters is if the Chinese make it to the south pole of the moon, which is where we think there is ice and water is, one, heavy and two, vital for both human and equipment consumption. And if you think you're going to make rocket fuel and stuff to go to Mars and other places, you need water. What happens if either country lands down there first? How do you keep the other person out? Can you? Do you want to? Is that because since you can't have sovereignty? But two, from a health and safety perspective, lunar dust and things like that is very different from Earth dust. It gets everywhere. It's very gritty. It can really damage equipment. So how do we interact, not cooperate, but simply interact around areas where there's only so many places that have eternally dark craters that may have water?
So we talked about the moon. Let's shift a little, talk about Mars. Maybe that'll be your next book. Dean, you can talk about the U.S. and China race to get to Mars. I was a little surprised when President Trump said in his inauguration speech that the U.S. will plant the stars and stripes on Mars. So China plans to bring samples from Mars to Earth as soon as 2028. And my understanding is that was originally supposed to be later, but now they have moved that deadline forward. So they want to have this achievement earlier. What are the implications of this new component of the space race, or space race 2.0, as you call it?
Well, to be the first nation to bring samples back from another planet is an enormous achievement. I mean, by any definition. It's not quite epoch marking. That's probably landing a person out there, planting the stars and stripes on Mars, wore the 5-star flag. But being the first to bring it back would, again, be a signal to the world. China's space program has now achieved something no one else has. And it wasn't a technology sort of, well, in 1969, we could have landed on the far side of the moon, but we chose not to. This is, nobody else has done it. And that would be very significant. It would say a lot about the level of their science and technology, the level of their deep space tracking, the level of the artificial intelligence on board the lander that would go out there and pick up samples, etc. Again, landing on Mars with a human crew is something Elon Musk has made very clear. He would like to die on Mars. And so for the Chinese, they're not just racing with the United States. This is one of the aspects of Space Race 2.0 again. They're also racing against Elon Musk. Because Mr. Musk, with Starship and his Mars effort, this is not an American government program. NASA has not endorsed this. NASA is not behind this. This is Elon Musk saying, I have a big checkbook. How much are we talking about here? For the Chinese, this is radically different, particularly because Mr. Musk, through SpaceX, with Starship and his earlier Falcon series, has demonstrated real innovation in terms of space production, churning out rockets and doing it in making them reusable. That has radically altered the economics of space. And that, too, is something that is factoring into Space Race 2.0. It is much cheaper now to put something up in orbit, and that has huge military as well as scientific and civilian applications.
Well, we've been talking with Dean Cheng, who is a senior advisor to the China program at the United States Institute of Peace and is also a non-resident fellow with George Washington University's Space Policy Program. And congrats again on the book. The title is China and the New Moon Race. Thanks for joining us, Dean.
Thank you for having me.